Okay, so we're in James. We've made it to the final chapter in James, James chapter 5. And our passage today is James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. And what we have here, there's this direct connection to the context that we've been looking at previously at the end of chapter 4, naturally, um, but even further back than that. But if you remember in our passage we looked at last time together, it starts in verse 13. It says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow, etc." This verse starts the same way. Chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Come now." The only time that James uses those words. So there seems to be a direct connection between the passage we looked at last and this section. And just as way of reminder, the passage we looked at last time was, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. Your life is a vapor. You are a mist." And we talked about the what James really wants us to have here and to see here is attitudes of humility that are necessary as creatures in response to the Creator God, that we are not God, that God is God. And he's been working this humility in us all the way up until chapter 5. And so it's in this attitude of humility, this context of humility, that we come to chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. And what we have in these verses is a style that is very familiar to the first century Jew and very familiar today to the Bible student, as it is a style that's directly parallel to the Old Testament prophets who are pronouncing doom on the nation of Israel. It's very similar language that is being used by James as he gives us a very serious reminder about money and about possessions and about the selfish accumulation of money and things. And in the Western world where we live, where amassing material wealth is not only condoned but admired, amassing more and more wealth is admired and encouraged. We Christians come to a passage like James 5, 1 through 6, and must grapple with the point that he's making here and ask what it looks like to amass too much. Is that possible? What does that look like in our lives? How should we be looking for those things? And so what we have here is three warnings from James about wealth. Three warnings from James, though implicit, about wealth. James 5, 1 through 6. Listen to this strong language. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person, and he does not resist you." Three things. The first one is this: wealth is a strong obstacle. It's a particularly strong obstacle, especially to Christian discipleship. Wealth is a strong obstacle to you following the Lord and knowing the Lord and being a disciple of Christ. James speaks so strongly here. We should hear his harshness and hear the warning of the level of strength that money has to harm us. And it's not something new in the Bible for James, right? This is a very biblical idea that wealth is dangerous when it comes to following Christ. Matthew 19:23. "Only with difficulty will a rich man enter the kingdom of heaven." There is simply no other way. Only with difficulty will a rich man enter the kingdom of heaven. That is, it is never easy for a rich person to have wealth and to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, as we looked at last week, we don't tend to identify ourselves. Not many people in the world tend to identify themselves as rich because you can always find somebody richer. But in every definition of the word rich throughout the history of mankind, all of us are wealthy, are rich, even compared to the rest of the world modernly. We are rich. Christian commentator Albert Barnes said, well, he said, "There's no sin in merely being rich. Where sin can exist with wealth consists in three things: the manner in which wealth is acquired, the way in which wealth is used, and perhaps chiefly, the spirit which wealth tends to engender in our hearts." The spirit which wealth tends to engender in our hearts. Money tends to affect our hearts greatly. Wealth, the desire for it, the way to spend it, tends to affect our hearts greatly. It draws us to it. It causes us to lust after more of it, to trust in it over all things for our security and for our happiness, to numb us to things that really matter, namely to numb us to the battle for holiness. Because you can really only pursue one thing with your heart. You've been called as a Christian to pursue Christ, by extension, to pursue holiness. There are few things in the world that will hinder that pursuit more than the pursuit of money, than the pursuit of wealth, than the pursuit of the comfort, the security, or the power that will come therewith. Alec Mateer says the more we surround ourselves with possessions that exist only for our comforts, the less likely we are to cultivate the spiritual physique required for battle for holiness. We find ourselves ministering to the spirit of pleasure, desiring and wanting for self, which is the root of all unholiness and unfaithfulness to God. He says the use of money and the life of self-pleasing are never far apart. Ezekiel 7, verse 19. Their silver and gold are not able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They cannot satisfy their hunger or fill their stomachs with it, for it was the stumbling block of their iniquity. It was the stumbling block of their iniquity. It was the reason that they fell. It was the thing that caused them to fall. Wealth. Wealth is dangerous for your soul. And it isn't just because of the means mentioned here. You could say, well, that's probably true that wealth is dangerous, but I'm just gonna give a lot away, which, by the way, is the best thing for you to do if you're wealthy, is to be overwhelmingly generous. I'm just gonna give a lot away, but here's the difficulty. Here's why it's so dangerous, that even if you do that, even if you are the person who makes a lot of wealth and gives a lot of it, there's still a specific and particular danger that comes with that. There's a special kind of pride with being that kind of giver. There's this new kind of tendency to a new kind of pride. Wealth is dangerous in every avenue, even if you use it to give. The truth is, the Christian must be humble. The Christian must pursue holiness, and it is difficult to be humble and rich. Truly humble in your heart, not just to show humility, but to actually be humble and rich is difficult. To actually pursue holiness and be rich is difficult. Money is like fire. It is a good gift of God to keep us warm, but it easily burns. Second, so wealth is by its nature dangerous and makes it more difficult to be a Christian. Secondly, wealth, the thing in which we put so much stock, will not last. Will not last. Verses 3 and 4. Verse 2. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will be evidenced against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. There's a parallel here to the passage we looked at last time, right? Where it says, your life is like a vapor. Your life is like a mist. Your life is like a puff of smoke. Your life is nothing. You are temporary compared to God. And the same idea is presented here. What is your money? It is moth-eaten. It is destroyed by moths. It is rusting and corroded. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 to 21. If you're familiar with the Bible, you probably called back to this passage as we read that one, because there's a direct parallel from James here, as he does with many passages from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 6 says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The thing you spend the massive majority of your life anxious about and wanting, more money, more wealth, or the things that those things can buy, can be destroyed by a moth. Nothing is temporary. Your wealth will come to naught the moment you die, and likely sooner. It will be nothing. have rotted, are moth-eaten, have corroded. And it's interesting here that we know that gold doesn't rust, right? But it speaks of gold rusting here because it might as well rust. Because it might as well, because of its losing of actual of value to us and value in reality, that it might as well become nothing. And all these words, these have corroded, uh, have rotted, are moth-eaten, all these kind of present tense, continual um, words. It's not just that your gold will corrode or your gold will rust. It's that it has rusted. It is moth-eaten. All these things are. So it isn't just that their glory disappears on Judgment Day. It's that you already are experiencing this. That you already are experiencing the glory of money that fades. If you get more money, you experience how that glory of that money fades. If you like every American in the world, if every person in the world thinks that they just need a 25% raise, everything will be better. You get that 25% raise, and then after a while, you think, well, where did that 25% go in the budget? It just disappeared. I just need another 25%. That it's always disappearing from its glory. That it's always losing its shine. That it always is rusting. That's even happening now. You thought that raise that you wanted 10 years ago would be enough, and somehow you filled it all over again and have more and more things that we continue to call necessities. The wealth you now have has already lost its luster, and you want more. Job 13:28, man wastes away like a rotten thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten. Why are you giving so much of your effort and your anxiety to trying to grasp and keep alive a vapor? Something that is temporary, shuffling around chairs in the deck of the Titanic. We looked at a passage from Luke chapter 12 when we were going through our Luke series, which was very powerful. We spent a couple of weeks on it, at least in part, where Jesus tells a parable about a rich man who has stored up his treasures. He says, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal, as opposed to laying up yourselves treasure on earth, which is by its very nature going to be destroyed. And it's already being destroyed in your heart if you're honest about it. Wealth will not last. Thirdly, wealth will stand as a witness. Wealth will stand as a witness. Verse 5. Verse 4. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. They are crying out against you. They are witnessing against you, is the idea here. The gold and silver, these rustless metals, right, are said to have rusted, meaning they bear the marks of disuse, not being used for what they were given to you for. God didn't give you gold so that you would allow it to rust. Remember the parable of the talents, where Christ gives these three men different amounts of money and then charges them to do things with that money. And the third one doesn't do anything with it. He buries it. And so the king comes back and he asks, what did you do with what I gave you? Quite literally, what did you do with the money that I gave you? And the man said, I buried it. God didn't give you money so that you could bury it, sit upon it, feel more comfortable, more secure, so you can make sure your children never had to work as hard as you. He didn't give it to you so that it would sit and rust. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, he says. The wealth will be a witness against you. If it's true that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, then if you want to know where your heart is, then your treasure is a witness to that. Your treasure will tell you what that is. What you treasure tells where your heart is. Your wealth will stand as a witness about your heart. And hoarding wealth is a denial of its proper use. Hoarding it is a denial of its proper use. Luke 12:33, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. It's also a denial of true trust. Hoarding wealth for yourself is an evidence of a denial of true trust in God. 1 Timothy 6:17, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. 1 Timothy 6:18 and 19, it is a denial of godly expectancy. It is a denial of what is to come, of eternal life. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so they may take hold of that which is truly life. Not saying that it's wrong to save and make sure that no one else has to care for you in the future. That's good. But I do think there's a limit to it, and it's probably smaller than we think that it is. They are to do good, be rich in good works, be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so they may take hold of that which is truly life. That is, storing up treasures in heaven. There's this draw from storing up treasures on earth to storing up treasures in heaven. Those of us who are rich, which is all of us, are to be rich in good works, to focus not primarily on storing up treasures here, as if God is not the primary source of our care, as if it's our wealth, as if God is given us that wealth to sit upon ourselves and not to use for his glory and his name and his kingdom. Verse 5 says, let's see. You have lived on earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. That is a fearfully vivid picture. Like so many unthinking beasts, cattle, luxuriating in their rich pasture day after day, growing fatter by the hour, and careless of the fact that each day, each hour brings the butcher nearer. Only the thin beast is safe in that day. The well-fed has made itself ready for the knife, Douglas Moo says. The idea of storing up and hoarding wealth for ourselves is like fattening ourselves for the day of slaughter. God did not create gold to rust. Every dollar you have has been given to you by God, and He didn't give it to you, nor did He give me mine, so that we could build our own little kingdoms for us to sit on more wealth than what we could ever really need. Here's the question put forth by this passage. If today, and this idea that wealth is a witness against you or to you, if today your soul is required of you, which it may be, and you stood in the courtroom of God, and the way you've spent your money stood up to testify, would it be testifying for you being Christ's disciple or against you? The way you spend your money speaks as loudly as anything else about what you truly believe. And finally, the message here, along with that prophetic line of Old Testament prophets, is that God will not let injustice win. God will not let injustice win. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. You have, again, fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. Come now, verse 1, you rich and weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. One of the primary themes of the Old Testament, especially the minor prophets, is that God does not let evil continue, that God does not let the rich oppression continue, that injustice will not continue. And God knows every moment that we did not have perfect integrity. Not one decision that we made was hidden from God. The fraud has not escaped His attention. And so we must be cognizant of the fact that God does not allow injustice to go unnoticed. Injustice, and our All of our financial dealings must be honest. People should want to use a Christian accountant, a Christian lawyer, a Christian doctor, a Christian electrician, a Christian contractor, not primarily because it feels good to help out a brother, but because they know that with them, every penny will be dealt with honestly. They'll deal honestly with their money. Verse 6 probably doesn't have in mind Christ as the righteous one when it says the righteous does not resist you, but it's difficult for Christ not to come to mind for the Christian when it speaks for the one who is righteous, who will not resist the evil one, who did not resist the evil that led to his cross. And that Judas sold Christ for money, and the righteous one did not resist. But we rest in the fact that God will not let the injustice of Christ, that God did not let the injustice against Christ win, and will not let the injustice against us through the form of the devil or anything else win either. That God defeated all things in Christ at the cross, including the injustices facing us, and primarily meaning the injustice of our sin against him. Love you, church. Talk to you soon.